Hi everybody, today we're going to be discussing the different types of vertebrae and different markings that are on the vertebrae. First I want to show you a picture of the entire vertebral column. And you can see that there are 5 different regions on the column. At the very top we have the cervical region, and this is made up of 7 cervical vertebrae. These are the smallest and the lightest because they're carrying the least amount of weight. All they have to carry is the weight of the cranium and the head. The next region is the thoracic region, and there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae articulate with the ribs, so since there are 12 ribs, it makes sense that there would be 12 thoracic vertebrae. The next section is the lumbar section, and there are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and these are the biggest and the largest vertebrae because they are holding up the weight of the rest of the spinal column. The sacral region is down at the bottom, and this is usually about 4 or 5 fused vertebrae. So they're large vertebrae that fuse together into one solid piece. And at the very end is something called the coccyx. We're not going to really look much more at the sacral vertebrae and the coccyx here. We're going to be concentrating on these 3 regions. And one way to remember how many vertebrae are in each is to think about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae, and you might have breakfast at 7 a.m. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and you might have lunch at 12. And if you are really hungry, you might have your dinner at 5 p.m. And there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. So if you remember breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that might help you remember the number of vertebrae in each of these regions. I also have examples of each of the different types of vertebrae. So you can see that the cervical vertebrae are the smallest and the lumbar vertebrae are the largest. The thoracic vertebrae are in the middle. I'm going to use one of the thoracic vertebrae to demonstrate some of the markings that you need to know from your lab practical list. Let me get that list here. Okay, so the most obvious thing to see here is this large solid area. This is called the body or the centrum of the vertebrae, and this is where most of the weight is held. You would have a disc in between on the top and the bottom of the centrum, and that would help to cushion the other vertebrae that might sit on top or below it. There's also a hole in the middle of all of the vertebrae, and this is where the spinal cord would go, and this is called the vertebral foramen. So remember, foramen is a hole. Vertebral foramen just means that it's a vertebrae and there's a hole in the middle of it. That's where the spinal cord would go. This part that's projecting off is called the spinous process. On this thoracic vertebrae, it goes almost straight down, but you can see on a lumbar vertebrae that spinous process kind of sticks straight out. And if you were to bend over and have somebody run their hand up your spinal cord, up your spine, you would actually feel the knobs of the spinous process down in the lumbar region. We also have transverse processes, so one on each side. And remember, transverse is a plane that goes through the body, separating top from bottom. So the transverse process makes sense that they're sticking out to the sides. So transverse process on either side. We also have something called the vertebral notch. And if you look at this from the side, you can see there's quite a large notched out area. If you can envision, of course I didn't bring an extra one home, but if you can envision there'd be another vertebrae sitting right underneath it, those two put together make a nice hole from the outside of the vertebral column to the inside. And that's in fact where the spinal nerves are going to leave the spinal cord and go out to the rest of the body, or perhaps bring in information from the body to the spinal cord. So, so that is the vertebral notch right there. The piece of bone that attaches the anterior side, the body or the centrum, to the posterior side, the spinous process, right here and right here are called the pedicle. So this piece right here is the pedicle. The lamina is this piece here that attaches the
transverse process to the spinous process. So here's a lamina and here's a lamina. The vertebral notch is on the side, so you can see it from the lateral aspect. What happens here is there's a space, and we start to stack up a couple of vertebrae together. They sort of look like this. Of course, there would be intervertebral discs between these, but that vertebral notch allows a hole for the spinal nerves to come out. So the spinal cord's in the middle, going through the middle in the vertebral foramen, and spinal nerves are going to be peeling off of there and coming out through that arch that's made by the vertebral notch. When you're looking at the superior aspect of the vertebrae, this part here that forms the side is the vertebral arch.
Now we have another marking that's only on the cervical vertebrae. And this is a cervical vertebrae. And you notice that on these transverse processes that we have, there are holes. Those are called transverse foramen. So we have a vertebral foramen, and then we have a transverse foramen on each side. And those transverse foramen provide a passageway for blood vessels and nerves and things to go up through the vertebral column from the head to the thoracic cavity. One way to tell that this is a cervical vertebrae is the fact that the only vertebrae that have these transverse foramen are the cervical vertebrae. They're also a lot smaller, and in most cases they have something called a bifid spinous process. This one doesn't really show it, but sometimes you'll see that this process will split into two and kind of have like a V shape on it, and that's what we call a bifid spinous process. So those three things that you can see, that they're small, that they have transverse foramen, and that there's a bifid spinous process, are going to give you those hints to know that this is a cervical vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae look quite different. They have a bigger centrum, and the spinous process is almost completely pointing inferiorly. It's pointing straight down. If you look at it, it looks like a giraffe. Now, they also have rib facets, which you can't really see on the plastic ones, but again, the thoracic vertebrae articulate with the ribs, and so they would have rib facets for where they articulate. The lumbar vertebrae look quite different. They're bigger. They have a much bigger centrum, and also the spinous process, instead of pointing down, pointing inferiorly, points posteriorly, so points straight out the back. They also look different when you look at them. Instead of looking like a giraffe, they kind of look like a moose. So they've got a little bit of a different face to them. So those are the ways to tell the difference. One other way you can tell is if you take a thoracic vertebrae and you try to put it down, it doesn't stand upright, because it just sort of leans over, whereas a lumbar vertebrae sits nicely on the table. Now, a word about the first two cervical vertebrae. Remember, I told you that the cervical vertebrae are going to have the transverse foramen, so you can see those here, and they're also going to have a bifid spinous process. You can see that here, how it's sort of split in two, and they're smaller. Now, these are the first two. These are the ones that hold up the skull. And they have very special names because they have some interesting things about them. The first cervical vertebrae is called atlas because it holds up the skull. It has two little smooth areas here that are going to articulate with the occipital condyles on the base of the skull. So it's going to sit like that. And in order to nod, it would actually slide back and forth. And you can see how the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord is going to come out, is lined up perfectly. Is lined up perfectly with the vertebral foramen in the cervical vertebrae. Now we can nod our head by just articulating and sliding back and forth on those occipital condyles. However, to shake our head, we have to do something different. We have a special kind of joint in here. If you look at C2 or axis, it's got this finger that points up and it sticks up. And instead of having a centrum or having a body on this first atlas on C1, the finger, which is called the dens, is going to stick up. And in this way, the atlas can actually pivot back and forth around the dens of C2 or axis. So we've got atlas and axis. Axis has a finger called the dens that sticks up, and the skull sits on top of both of them. So if you were going to shake your head no, let me see if I can do this. I think I need an extra hand to hold this all together. If you were going to shake your head no, I don't think I can do it. Well, you're going to have to use your imagination. If the skull was sitting on top here, shaking your head no would involve moving around this pivot joint here. Okay, that's everything you need to know about the vertebrae. See you in class.